Okay, so let's begin. There's just so much. There's so much in these two. There's so much in these two parshas that obviously we can only touch a few topics. The parsha of Nedarim is something which, on the one hand, is difficult to understand. The focus on the notion of a neder, a vow, or how that works. I think it's also interesting, of course, that the positioning here, right at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, almost stands in its own by Rosh Hamatos. This whole idea that it's spoken, there's some there seems to be big messages in the concept of Nedarim, and the reason perhaps that we need to try and understand those messages, particularly here, is of course because we are generally discouraged from making Nedarim. Right, most cases, right? Obviously that's discussed extensively in the Gemara. So if you're discouraged from making vows, what is the main thrust and purpose other than telling us what you do in order to resolve it, which is the key focus of the parish, obviously, how they are annulled and how they can be removed, etc., depending on the personal situation. So let's start with a broad approach and then something a bit deeper. Ramichta Melio discusses the concept of what it means to make a commitment. And he understands that the key message, or a key message you have to take from this parsha, is this idea of k'chol hayotzim and pivyasa. You have to try and detach almost the notion of a neder and saying, well, if I make a neder, of course I have to keep it because I made a neder. And the concept of k'chol hayotzim and pivyasa, the idea and the power of what it means to commit. And in life, we have to be committed people. Because if we're not committed people, then we go through our entire lives with, as the Gemara says, hein v'lav v'rafya b'yada. Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe I'll do this, maybe I won't. So, it's weak. There's nothing permanent, right? He says the following thing: Geder hadovar hi, who the key point is she'aroyes atzmo rofui be'eza inyan, a person who sees himself weak in a certain subject, certain topic. And he wants to improve, wants to strengthen himself, wants to do tshuva. But he knows it's not going to last. He knows that whatever he does, this idea of turning over a new leaf, it's only temporary. Brings a Gemara in Nedarim which says, at the time of the Yitzhar, no one remembers the Yitzhar Tov. You forget the Yitzhar Tov with the Yitzhar. So what do you do? What is the idea? What is the way of fixing that? And he's explaining the meaning behind the Gemara in Nedarim, which says that you're allowed to make a shavua to be mekayim a mitzvah, to follow mitzvah. The Gemara says you're allowed to do something to basically spur yourself on to do the right thing. And the Ran says there in Nedarim that even kasherim, people who generally don't make a shavua, right, refrain from making oaths, they do make a shvua in this context. David HaMelech says, Nishbati v'akayema, right? I make a shvua and I fulfill it. Why? Because this is a powerful tool to be able to make sure you keep to a commitment. You should make yourself tied to it. You have to compel yourself. And how does that work? A person should organize all his matters so that the way he conducts himself or herself is already in a situation of it has to be this way. It's not that it's a preferred option, maybe if I feel like it. It's something committed. He says, you have to jump into the sea, like Kriyas Yamsuf. And then you'll find the Siyata Dishmaya. Then you'll find the support from Shemayim, Lekiyam Hachlotosoi, to fulfill one's decisions. And he says that this is the concept of Yesh Koina Ulomoy B'Shua Achas. That's what it means. You can acquire your world in one moment. It's a beautiful way of understanding. There's a famous Gemara which says there are some people who can do something amazing, something so incredible that they basically earn Olam Haba in 1 second. That's why you can never judge anyone else. The idea of judging someone is ridiculous. The notion you can judge someone else. Since we have a concept of Yesh Koina Ulomoy B'Shua Achas, that a person can do something, which basically means they earn the Olam Haba, so it becomes foolish and it becomes a joke to try and judge anyone else. How can you possibly judge anyone else? You have no idea what they might have done. 30 years ago, they might have done something which has already given them a passport, right? Who knows? He has a different explanation. Sometimes you can do something in life which is so powerful and so strong, right, that it literally acquires your own world for you. And he's talking about this idea of making yourself committed to do something. And it's something which is not external. It's not something which is externally imposed. It's voluntary. You're imposing, that's the concept of a neder, for sure, right? It's a voluntary imposition. No one's telling you to do it. No one's telling you have to make yourself committed to do something. The voluntary idea to impose constraints on on yourself, in terms of, in a sense, limiting your choices, limiting the options you have, but in a positive way, right? You limit what your choices are because you know that that is the best pathway towards achieving something. That's a positive thing, and it's something which has tremendous potential, and it is the heart behind the notion of a neder, right? The idea of how we need to be committed people in life and sometimes take steps to make sure that we genuinely are committed. Whether that involves making a neder itself has very specific rules, but the idea of being committed is fundamental. So that's the approach of the Mechtam Eliyahu Rav Dessler. The Rav Dalia Shor and the Rav Gedaliah says the following thing. He says that Tzodek HaKohen says, we've mentioned this in the past a number of occasions, if you want to try and understand the root of a concept, you need to go back to the first places mentioned in the Torah. Always do that. You go back to the beginning. Where do we find this idea first? Many times you have this notion. And the interesting thing is that the first time the notion of a neder is mentioned is not here, but it's with Yaakov Avinu. Right? What was that? In Parshas, yeah, Yaakov Avinu. What is it exactly? Yaakov neder leimor. Yaakov makes a neder, and he says, "Whatever nazos something about he's running away from Esav." Right, beginning of Parshas Vayetze, he says, "I'll put up this Evan. This will be Matseva. Yia, right? Something about Yia Beis Elokim. This will be a Beis Elokim, the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what I'm going to do." And he makes a neder, right? If you return me in safety and security, I will. He says, "I'll fulfill it." The Medrash says there in Parshas Rabbi, Yaakov posach b'neder tchila. He's the very first one to make a vow, to make a neder. And Rabbi also says there as well. He brings a posuk in Tehillim. It says, Asher nishbal Hashem. This is in Tehillim Kuflam base. Asher nishbal Hashem neder la'abir Yaakov. La'avir Yaakov. It doesn't say Avi Yitzchak, Avram. It says Yaakov. Same thing, right? The neder is associated with Yaakov Avinu. Now, what we do see, though, that the context, both in Parshas and in Tehillim, which refers to the neder of Yaakov, is clearly about finding a place for Hashem, a mokum for the Shechina, the idea of Kedusha, the idea of the Beis HaMikdash. Pasuk in Tehillim says, continues that in the same capital of Tehillim, it says, "Im avo b'oel beisi, imetein shnas le'inai, adem som mokum l'Hashem, mishkanes la'aver Yaakov." Right? The idea of finding a mokum l'Hashem, a place for Hashem, and that's what's going on in Parshas Vayetze. So you see, he says Rabbi Dalia Shor like this. You see that the fundamental idea of a neder is to build something for Hashem's Shechina to rest. That's the origins of it. The Ramban and Rabbeinu Bachai say here, and he brings the idea here, that the idea of a neder is to make a neder b'chaye hamelech. That's what he says. That's the phrase he uses. To make a neder b'chaye hamelech literally means by the life of the king. By the life of the king. He says he brings the difference. This is the Ramban. The Ramban at the beginning of it's the middle of the long piece on Pasuk Gimel here at the beginning of the Parsha. He says that he brings a Sifri. The difference between Nedarim and Shvuas is that Nedarim is Kanoda B'chai HaMelech, by the life of the king. A Shvua is Nishba B'melech Atzmei, the king himself. He goes on to talk about this and what this idea means and the meaning behind it. The meaning behind it is. But Rabbi Dalia Shor says that even though these are very deep ideas, what does it mean to make a neder by the Chai HaMelech, the life of the thing? What does that mean in terms of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? But he says again, you see the same idea that the fundamental point about a neder is to come close to Hashem. That's why Yaakov makes that neder, to build a place for the Shechina. The Gemara in Nedarim says that Rabbi Nosson Omer, another famous Gemara, Hanodikilu Bama Bama, someone who makes a neder, it's like he's built an altar, for Hamakaimak, a private altar, And when we fill the neder, it's like you offer the korban on top of it. And the Ratan says it's like you build something at the time when you're not allowed to do so. But if you're makayim it, you fulfill it, right? In other words, you're not matir the neder, you don't remove the neder. It's as if you've offered on it a korban and you're chayav for shchutei chutz, for shechting outside the Beis Hamikdash. He says, obviously, this is talking about neder shelo l'shem shamayim, for the wrong purposes, okay? And he says like this, he says that since a neder l'shem shamayim, the foundation of a neder for the sake of shamayim, and the sake of it is to be close to Hashem, right up to the point of even building the Beis Hamikdash, as Yaakov Avinu wants to do. And therefore, if a person's neder is not l'shem shamayim, he wants to come close to Hashem, but not for the right reasons. In other words, he almost wants to abuse the concept of a neder. It's something which is meant, its foundation is to be used for coming close to Hashem. Yaakov Avinu, that's what he does. If a person abuses that and uses it for the wrong reason, right, for the wrong reasons, okay, it's like bringing a korban on a forbidden mizbeach, like being makriv bachutz outside the Beis Hamikdash. That's the idea behind it. In other words, once we understand that fundamentally a neder exists in order to draw close to Hashem, we also understand why, if you use a neder for the wrong purpose, yeah, it's like building a private mizbeach in your back garden for the wrong reason, for the wrong reasons. And it all makes it fits in perfectly. He says that according to this, we can understand why it is that we always read Parshas Nedarim during Bein HaMetzarim, always in the 3 weeks, right? Because if the concept of a neder is to come close to Hashem, and fundamentally the way and the aim, the ultimate way of coming close to Hashem is through the building of the Beis HaMikdash, these days are meant to arouse within us that idea and that notion of closeness, of Kedusha, and that longing for the Beis HaMikdash itself. But the idea is that this isn't something abstract. This isn't something which is removed from us. It begins with us individually, as individual people, to put ourselves in a place where we're able to connect to that notion of Kedusha and that notion of spirituality as represented by the Beis HaMikdash. And that is why we have this idea. This is expressed, I think it was originally taken from the Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, I think, popularized it, but it was really, I think it's based on the Sefer Charedim. He brings it here as well, not in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner. The concept of Bilvovi Mishkan Evner, right? It starts Bilvovi. The Mishkan Evner, I will build a Mishkan, right, is within my heart. That's the way forward. That's the way to do it. And therefore, once each individual is able to do that, together, the entire tzibur can then build the Beis HaMikdash together. So it fits beautifully. In other words, we lay always Parshas Nedarim during the 3 weeks, and Parshas Nedarim fundamentally has a claim on each of us to try and, if you like, emulate the approach of Yaakov Avinu, who wants and desires and aims to come so close to Hashem that he makes a neder in order to do so, to build the Beis HaMikdash. The Bilvovi, that's the Bilvovi Mishkan. There's a private Mishkan, there's a private place to build a connection to Hashem that we each have, and then together it comes together to form the Beis HaMikdash. It's a beautiful idea, I think, that he expresses here. Let me share with you another idea here. There is a question. There's a significant question on the actions and the way Moshe Rabbeinu. Number one, the action of Moshe Rabbeinu, and number two, in terms of the war of Midian, which comes afterwards in Parshas, slightly after the Parsha of Nedarim, and also the idea of why it is that Moshe Rabbeinu's passing is linked to this war of Milchemes Midian. What is the connection? What is the connection between them? What is the connection between the two of them? So you'll begin with the idea. Firstly, an idea of Chaim Shmulevitz. Rabbi Barachano, no, it's not that. 1 second, it's this. No, yeah, it's a medrash here, right? So he brings a medrash. The medrash says, Omar Afuna, B'shloshim Mekomes K'as Moshe. 3 places we find that Moshe Rabbeinu is angry, turns to anger. V'nis alma mimenu halacha, and it has the consequences on all 3 occasions are the same. That the halacha is so to speak hidden from him, and he needs to seek advice. He needs to ask Hashem, what should I do? What are the three examples? Very fascinating idea, this. B'Shabbos, Klimatchus, right? Uba'oinin. There are three cases. Number one is on Shabbos, when it says, in other words, the very beginning, in B'Shalach, right? In B'Shalach, Moshe is angry, Moshe, okay? And because of that, because they left over from the mod, right, for the next day, he forgot to tell them Shabbos Hayom. And afterwards, if you look through the Parshas B'Shalach, you'll see that afterwards, he goes again and says to them, he goes and says, this is what I was told to tell you, that it's Shabbos Hayom, today is Shabbos. But it happens after, there's a gap. He didn't tell them earlier, he, so to speak, forgot to tell them that it was the reason why it didn't fall was because of Shabbos. The discovery comes afterwards, and that's because he was angry for the fact that they left over when they were told not to do so. That's the first example. The second example is here in this week's Parsha, Perek Lamed Aleph, Posuk Yud Daled 2 says Zion, Vayiktof Moshe al Pekudei Hechoil, that he was angry with what they did. Why was he angry with them? Because Hachayisem Kol Nekeva, you left alive every Nekeva. Why did you do that? Hein Heino Hoyu Livnei Yisrael B'dvar Bilam. They were the ones. What are you doing? He told them. You left alive the females or certain groups of females, whatever, right? Because that's crazy. He says the whole point of this battle was to take revenge because of what the women did. So that, right, and you left them alive. So that doesn't, you've done something wrong. Hein Heino Hoyu Livnei Yisrael B'dvar Bilam. That's the second example. And it says, how do you know the halacha was hidden from him? Because the halachas of the kli matchus, in other words, how to tovel, the kashering, and everything else that is described in this week's parsha, is hidden from Moshe Rabbeinu. He forgot to tell them, so to speak, and therefore it says, these are the rules, and this is what you need to do. This is how to kasher the kelim that you received from the Klei Midjan. That's hidden from Moshe Rabbeinu because he is angry. And the third example is when he has this very cryptic debate in Parshas Shmini with Aaron HaKohen's sons. Remember, they left over one of the chator. There were 3 chators, and they left over one of them. Why did you not consume it? And he's angry with them as well. And therefore, again, he forgot the halacha, which was that an oinen is not allowed to eat kodshim. Yeah, they said to him, "How you say? Would it be should we have eaten it? We're owning it. They were owning him. They not even of you had just died. They shouldn't. That was their response. So 3 examples. Now, the problem is, says Rucham Shadeh, is like this. Why this one is very difficult to understand, because the anger was completely logical. It was perfect. I mean, he's the leader. And he asked them to carry out a dangerous and difficult mission for one purpose, and they didn't do it. So it's obvious, it's logical for him to have a measure of anger at them. That was the main reason, and therefore, why is it that he was that he forgot the halacha in this way? Also, he says the same thing with the mon. It says, Ish al Yosem v'Noad Boker. They left over. They shouldn't have done it. There's logic. There was a logical reason for him to be upset. Okay? This was something clearly wrong. And he says that he goes on, I think, to talk about the other example later on. We're not going to go into that now because that's mainly concerned with Parshas Shmini. But the point he wants to try and bring out from this is as follows: that he says, Shema shechochmoso mistalekes mimenu. That which his chokhmah was removed from him as a result, it wasn't a punishment. No punishment for becoming angry. There was a logical reason for him to be angry. There's a place for it. Elohu inyan tivi says it's a natural, automatic consequence. Because the existence, being in a place of anger, he calls it soref as chokhmah shel adam. It burns up a person's logic and intelligence and ability to retain information. But makes no difference. It could be right. It could be right to be angry in this context. It makes no difference. It's automatic. You end up losing the chokhmah in some way. That's what the Torah wants to tell us. Of course, we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. We can't compare ourselves possibly to his level, of course. But the way Reb Chaim Shmulevitz understands it is the message the Torah is conveying in these three examples is that it might be entirely sensible and logical sometimes in life to react with kas, with anger. But you need to know, right? Not that we're justifying it, but the point is sometimes it's logical, it makes sense. But you need to know the risk. It's a very risky business because automatically a person is bekas, he makes mistakes. He loses, the chokhmah goes. And then afterwards, people around him will say, why did he do that? Like, and the answer is because it's illogical. You're now in the sphere of, you're in an illogical place now. You're not acting with logic. Things don't work. The chokhmah isn't there. The wisdom, the natural wisdom that a person has. That's what Chaim Shmulevitz says. The second idea that I wanted to share with you is one brought in the Be'er Yosef, Yosef Salant. And he says, he brings a sifri, and this is reflected, I think, in, it's really in the Pasuk, Lamed Aleph Beis. Lamed Aleph Pasuk Beis. The Torah says, Moshe, Hashem says, Moshe Rabbeinu, Nekoim nikmas b'nei Yisrael me'esa mijonim, achar tel sleif l'mecha. You need to wreak vengeance against the mijonim, and that's it. And then you're going to pass away. The Sifri says that the Misa of Moshe Rabbeinu, okay, I think Rashi brings this here as well. I think Rashi brings it here. Yeah, Rashi brings it as well. Even though he saw that his own passing was dependent, it was tied up with the battle of Midian, nevertheless, he didn't delay. He did it with simcha. Okay? And again, there's also Medrash Rabbah, which says that had he wanted to, he could have delayed it for a long time because it was all dependent. It was wrapped up together. So the question is why? Why should Moshe Rabbeinu's passing be tied to this particular battle? There are many things, many battles, many things that underwent. Why? Do away with Midian, and then you will be gathered in. Why is that? So he says like this. The idea is that in many places we find that the Torah is very concerned that when they enter Eretz Yisrael, they will actually do away with all the Avodah Zarah. Not a simple thing at all. They're all right back to Parshas, you're right at the beginning, Parshas Mishpatim and Kisis. So it's emphasized again and again. When you enter Israel, you need to deal with them. You need to deal with all of these negative influences, and you need to remove all of the Avodah Zarah. You learn through Nach, and you realize how difficult it was. How many times they didn't really remove everything, and they were still there. This is how it is. Okay, and this is something which is going to be a major challenge to them. The message is, he says, that what did the Midyanim do? They caused tremendous damage by putting the Bnei Yisrael in this position of temptation, by causing them to have these forbidden relationships with the Bnei Midian, and also come to be Oved Avodah Zarah as a result. Therefore, they are commanded to wreak vengeance against Midian because of the concept Godol Hamachtio Yosemei Ahorgoi. The people, those who cause others to sin, are effectively worse than those who kill them. And he says like this, as long as Bnei Yisrael are not able to work on themselves, as long as they cannot internalize, or we cannot internalize, just how bad it is to be machti esarabim, to lead others astray, to convince others to do the wrong thing, and how, if we do and we are faced with that type of situation of those leading others astray to sin, how critical it is to deal with it. As long as we haven't internalized that, it's not possible to enter Eretz Yisrael. It's not possible because they won't be able to drive out the Canaan. They won't be able to remove the problem because they won't understand how dangerous it is. And that is why the lesson has to be learned. The lesson has to be learned to battle against the Midyanim. Not an easy thing to do. Many people struggle with this idea. Nakom nikmas. Nakoma. Well, it's over. It's past. They've done damage already. Well, let's move on. Let's enter Israel. No, it's difficult. Hashem says you need to understand that this battle is meant to teach you that there is wrong and right in the world. And sometimes you need to remove that wrong, because if you don't properly do the sur meirah, if you don't remove the negativity, there is no space for the tov to grow. There is no space for the positivity. And therefore he says like this, that as long as the Bnei Yisrael are not ready to enter Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu stays alive, right? Because he is bound up. He's, because of what happened with Mei Meriva, yeah, he is told, you will not be able to lead them into Eretz Yisrael. Meaning, if they enter, only when they're ready to enter, is it time for you to pass away. And therefore, as long as they haven't battled with Midian, and understood that they need to remove those who cause them to stumble in Chait, they're not ready to enter Eretz Yisrael. And if they're not ready to enter Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu stays alive. It's as simple as that. As long as they're still tied to not understanding what it means to remove the negativity, you with me? Then they are never able to enter Eretz Yisrael, and Moshe Rabbeinu will stay alive. And Mordechai Miller, in his Sefer Shabbos Shurim, he brings something which I think ties beautifully with this. He says that that the famous idea of the difference in the phraseology, Mattos-Masei and Mattos-Masei at the beginning of Parshas, why it changes the order. And he says that when they said Ve'ela Maseihem Mattos-Masei, they counted their journeys according to their leaving Mitzrayim. They were Maseihem Mattos-Masei. They were trying to run away. They were trying to run away from what they had left in Mitzrayim. But the feeling of where they were was still dragging them back. Their connections, the negativity of Mitzrayim, was still dragging them back. That was why, in other words, and had they still been dragged back and held on for Maseihem L'Motzoehem, that the connection of the journey was to where you're coming from, they would have entered Eretz Yisrael in the wrong way. They would have entered Eretz Yisrael solely looking for material pursuits. That's what they would have wanted. We want to just build up a life of just physicality without that sense of spirituality. And that's why it took so long. That's why the journey took so long, because they had to get to a place where, as Moshe Rabbeinu directs them to, the idea being the Matzoehem L'Maseihem. It's not that you're trying to get away from there, you're trying to go here. Get rid of the Sur Meirah, and then you're able, Asay Tov, then you're able to do the positive things as well. The Bnei Yisrael have a task at hand. They have to understand that they need to detach themselves from the Ra, that's the Melchemes Midian, to remove those negative influences, to detach themselves completely for what's hot, for the things that are holding them back based on their connection with Mitzrayim, which is obviously linked to the same idea, so that they can then journey forward and build a true society based on the values of the Torah, which is L'Maseihem. That's where they're journeying towards the aim, the ultimate aim and ambition that they want to achieve through where they were going to. Okay, only covered a small amount, but have a very good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Okay.